And that means that universities are abandoned. That means that courts are abandoned because nobody's, has the resources to maintain these institutions.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in today. In this video, we are going to do a follow-up to our previous video about similarities between Rome and the US and how this coincided with the debasement of the silver denarius. We ended with a discussion of the crisis of the 3rd century as well as the Edict of Maximum Prices, with which Emperor Diocletian tried to stop the inflation in 301 AD. Well, after that, the empire went on existing for another 200 years until about 476 AD, but it was greatly weakened by this economic collapse. Now we are going to talk about the collapse itself and the role the Visigoths as well as gold and silver played in the end. Could modern society collapse like ancient Rome did? Stay tuned to hear about these topics. For this conversation, it's an honor to have Oren Elbaz back here with me once again. He is an economist and a sound money advocate hailing from Israel. Oren, welcome back.
Hello, how do you do?
Doing great. It's great to speak with you again tonight. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Very excited to talk about this topic, which I find to be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic. Before the collapse of Rome, the Visigoths had started to become a real problem. But before the Visigoths, the Gothic tribes, which are widely believed to have originated in southern Sweden but had traveled to the area of the Baltic Sea, uh, started attacking. Now, they started attacking in the 3rd century. The first attack that was recorded was in 238. They attacked and took a city called Histra, and they were given a subsidy to leave. And this might have kind of set the stage for future events. Also, from 249 to 268, the Goths had attacked Rome in the Black Sea region multiple times. It's speculated that they were taking advantage of internal revolts in Rome that had left Rome more vulnerable in that time period. In the late 4th century, the Visigoths started migrating into Rome after the Huns had been encroaching in their region.
Yes. So the interesting period, of course, Rome was attacked by barbaric tribes throughout its history. This wasn't new. This wasn't news for them, but they always managed to repel them. And the might of the Roman army, the might of their legions was, it was famous, and those tribes were truly fearful of the Romans. But things changed in the late fourth century when those Goths, those tribes, they invaded the Roman Empire, and for the first time in history, they were not repelled. The empire wasn't able to repel them. Now, the story is that they migrated into the Roman Empire due to the invasion of the Huns into their territory, which forced them to leave, which forced them to enter regions of the Roman Empire. And the emperor at the time, who was called Valens, tried to destroy them. And there was a battle in 378 AD. It's called the Battle of Adrianople, but he was defeated by them and he died in battle, which of course was a huge shock because it was very, very rare that a Roman Empire would die in battle. And his successor, who was called Theodosius, uh, pretty much had no alternative but to allow them to stay. And there was kind of an agreement between the Goths and the Romans that they would stay as Roman, if not citizens, then at least subjects, and they would pay taxes, serve in the Roman army, and in return they would have autonomy. But Theodosius manages to stabilize matters, but still, this is a first sign of weakness that the Roman Empire is unable to repel an invading tribe.
Right. And so sometimes if you can't beat them, join them, is the idea. And so some of these Visigoths started getting command positions within the Roman military in this time period, is my understanding.
Yes, but the Romans never gave them real positions of power. They kind of exploited them. There was kind of a bit of racism towards them because they were considered of low background. They weren't cultured enough. They weren't sophisticated like the Roman aristocrats. So the Romans looked down at them, and the Visigoths were always incensed by that. They never managed to really be incorporated into Roman society. So I want to mention that at the time, okay, the Roman Empire was split into two. There was the western part and the eastern part, and it was Diocletian himself, we mentioned him, that invented this system. It was meant so that they could better rule because the empire was so large, so huge. They wanted to have two emperors, one in the west, one in the east, so that they would be able to respond more quickly to events, to a crisis in their region. And this system was called the Tetrarchy because it relied on two emperors and their successors, which were chosen, so that if the emperor dies, there's going to be a successor immediately, someone to replace him. And this system, well, it was a nice idea, but it didn't really work because even though there was a designated successor at each and every point in time, they didn't respect that the decision of the deceased emperor, and there was some treachery, and there were some revolts, and eventually didn't last long. But at the time, okay, when Theodosius died, he left the two parts of the empire to his two sons. He had two sons. One was called Arcadius. He was supposed to rule the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now know as the Byzantine Empire. And his son Honorius was supposed to be the emperor of the West. But those his children, they were kind of young. They were young at the time, and they weren't powerful enough to rule themselves. They needed to rely on generals and advisors. So that's another reason why the empire was kind of in a weak spot.
Weak leadership. Absolutely. So after Valen's death, Theodosius becomes emperor. And then in 394, that was the first battle that I noticed Alaric being mentioned. The Visigoth leader uh, at the Battle of the Frigidus River,
Yes,
he had been put on the front lines, and his guys took a lot of heavy tolls
casualties.
because of that. Yeah, they took a lot of casualties. After this, he was pretty upset with how that all happened, and he started raising an army again. And he had been out raiding in the Balkans, and they had offered him a command position, and which chilled him out for a little bit. But then he started raiding again, and he asked for more. He asked to be supreme commander of the Roman military. Well,
Yeah, just imagine what an absurd position is to have like this army within your country within your empire, which is not exactly faithful to the empire. Its allegiance depends on, constantly bribing them because they don't feel themselves as true Romans, and they don't believe in the Roman Empire. They are as though conquering it from within.
But what a weird political situation to be in. And yeah, I couldn't imagine living in a country that was operating like that. But
And
it's
the Roman Empire was forced to put up with it because they didn't have the military power to destroy them, or to expel them from the empire. Just had to put up with them.
right.
So we arrive. I want to mention that Honorius, the Western emperor, he relied on a powerful general who was called Stilicho. And Stilicho, he was a member of his family because he married his cousin Serena. And he was a powerful leader and probably a resourceful leader who was able to, navigate all those tribes who were surrounding the empire and sometimes penetrating, sometimes conquering parts of the empire. He managed to somehow keep things together. But in 408 AD, he was accused of treason and he was executed. Him and his son were put to death. And one of the reasons I'm figuring out that because he was half Roman and half Vandal, Vandals were another tribe which the
Of
Romans were
Germanic
fighting with.
origin.
Yes. So because he was half Roman and half Vandal, he wasn't truly accepted by the Roman aristocracy. So those Roman, very distinguished Roman citizens, they didn't accept him. So there was a hint of racism there. Although he was a very competent leader, he was put to death, and this made situation even worse because now there was no strong leadership to replace him.
Yeah, that had to be the beginning of the end for them because it does make me wonder if because he was part Vandal, if that was helping him have a better understanding of how to negotiate with the Visigoths. He wasn't a purely of Roman origin. And like you were saying, he was a competent leader. He was someone that was there to protect Rome, and they put him to death in 408 after accusing him of treason. And then in the winter of
Yes.
408, Alaric starts a siege on Rome.
Yes. So Alaric sees that there's a power vacuum. So he can just, march on Rome. Now, we have to explain at the time, the emperor, the Western emperor, wasn't situated in Rome itself. The court, the imperial court, was moved to Ravenna, which was easier to defend. And Italy itself was left unprotected. And so Alaric starts marching south towards Rome, and he sacks cities, he destroys cities on his way, and Rome itself is just fearful, and the Roman Senate is fearful of what is going to happen, and they are hoping for, Honorius to send help, but he does nothing. He just leaves that the city, which is at the time the greatest city in the world with close to 1 million inhabitants,
Huge
just leaves
population,
it, yeah, just leaves it to the mercy of the Visigoths.
just
And
undefended. Yeah.
yeah, undefended. And so what happens is the Visigoths arrive and they lay siege to the city. And of course, Rome at the time was dependent on constant import of food, with ships that sailed up the Tiber River, and it was as a result of this siege, you had famine inside Rome. It was protected by those huge walls. It was defended by, the people defended themselves behind walls, but they were starving.
Right. And then you think about all the people in the big cities today. If the supply chains dry up, what is going to happen to these huge population centers?
Yes, that's exactly one of the reasons why this is so reminiscent of today, because today we have large cities such as New York cities who rely on constant imports of food almost on a daily basis just to
Absolutely.
sustain themselves. And if for some reason the supply of food stops, then you're probably going to have chaos within 48 hours. What happens is that the Roman Senate sends envoys to Alaric to negotiate with them. And in return for lifting the siege, Alaric is willing to lift the siege if the Romans give him all their gold and silver.
Yes. That sounds like a smart man. He knew what to go after.
So yeah, he thinks to himself, why do I even need to fight this battle? If the Romans are going to give me all their gold and silver, I'm just going to take it. He also wants them to free all the barbarian slaves because they had many barbarian slaves there of Germanic origin. And so, if the slaves are free, then they're going to probably join him and
Get some
his
fresh recruits. Yeah.
yeah, fresh recruits. So, okay, so we have an account of what happened during those negotiations, and one envoy asked what would be left to the citizens of Rome, and Alaric replies, "Their lives. They will be left with their lives, and they should be happy with that."
Yeah, he was in there to plunder everything. And so how much gold and silver was given to them?
Okay, so eventually they came to an understanding that the Goths will receive 5,000 pounds of gold and 30,000 pounds of silver in exchange for lifting the siege. Now, we should point out that we're probably talking about a Roman pound, which was smaller than a present day pound, than the modern pound. It was equal to 327 grams. And therefore, I calculate that this amounts to 1.6 metric tons of gold and 9.8 metric tons of silver. I'll repeat it, 1.6 metric tons of gold and 9.8 metric tons of silver, which in today's prices, it amounts to about $140 million worth of gold and $10 million worth of silver.
Wow.
Now, that may sound like a huge sum, but mind you, in order to save the largest city of the world, that's not such a huge sum of money. Now, if you think about it, think about New York, for instance, present day New York. I mean, just the wealth and the buildings and the art and which exists in New York City nowadays, it's in the trillions.
Oh yeah. Well, and compared to like modern central banks, I mean, to be in the top 10 globally, you would need to have, if I remember correct, off just offhand, over 615 tons of gold in your central bank to get in the world top 10. So by modern standards, yeah, these aren't very big numbers,
Yes.
but for their hoard, it was probably, seemed pretty significant at the time.
Yes, for them it was very significant, but it strikes me as interesting that compared to present day prices of gold and silver, it's not such a huge sum in order to save the greatest city in the world at the time.
Yeah, a major city. Imagine if I don't know, let's just say if there was a major city here in the US under siege and we were looking at going to a long war, something like the Ukraine-Russia situation, or we could just pay 140 million and they'd leave. Well, that would probably be more cost effective for us today than fighting it out with those people.
Yeah, I think it's an indication that the price of gold and silver is currently very low, that they are extremely undervalued. It's yet another indication of how undervalued they were. I mean, like if you were to
Absolutely.
ransom a city for 10 times as much, let's say $1.5 billion. Now that sounds like a more reasonable sum to me.
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
perhaps that would be on the low side as well. Who knows?
And we do know
So,
that silver is extremely undervalued. That does speak a lot to that. Okay, clearly, the purchasing power is much higher in that era.
yes. So it's interesting that to raise the money, each and every senator of the Roman Senate agreed to contribute some of his personal wealth. But they started squabbling and they started fighting among each other, and none of them wanted to contribute. So eventually, the sum came up short. There wasn't enough gold and silver to meet the demands of Alaric. So they were forced to start melting down pagan statues of their gods, which were covered with gold and some of them were made of silver. So they started melting down those statues and dismantling their own shrines in order to make up the difference. And there
That
is
is
a
crazy.
story, yeah, there's an account by an historian at the time called Zosimus. He reports that one of those statues which they melted was of Virtus. Virtus was the god of courage in battle. Yeah, the god of courage in battle. And they had to melt him down in order to placate the Visigoths. And he says that when it was melted down to pay the barbarians, it seems as though that remained of the Roman valor was extinguished with it. But just imagine that you take the god which represents courage in battle and you use it, you melt it down in order to pay the barbarians so they don't slaughter you. Like that's just such a display of weakness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know what a good modern equivalent would be other than if we melted down the Statue of Liberty to try and pay off some debt to some country that was attacking us. I mean, so that was a really strong sign that they were reaching the end of their rope when they melted that statue down. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
especially
an
because of what it represented, courage in battle, but that they had to melt
yes.
it down.
That's an amazing comparison because for them, for the Romans, courage in battle was the highest value. And for Americans, present day Americans, liberty is the
Freedom.
highest value. So if you melt down the Statue of Liberty in order to satisfy someone else, some foreign power, that means you have given up on liberty.
Right. Well, and you feel there you have absolutely no other choice. Like
Yes.
and so that's a bad sign if something like that's happening. But basically, they just haven't completely toppled you either because it's too time consuming or inconvenient, or but pretty much you're done at that point. At least in my mind, it's the beginning of the end.
So what happens next is that the Romans take the gold and the silver and they simply leave. And Rome is intact. Rome is saved. That happened in 408 AD. So, but although Rome was saved at that instance, at that certain opportunity, it signaled weakness to other tribes also.
Oh yeah.
Because because until that point in time, Rome was considered to be so mighty, so great that you can never conquer it. It was an eternal city which reigned over the world for 1,000 years at the time.
Right.
And just imagine other tribes hearing that, hey, this guy Alaric went to Rome and laid siege on it and got all their gold and silver in as ransom. It's just amazing. It completely shatters
Their
the
image of
image
Rome. Yeah,
of Rome as a powerful empire.
yeah, no, absolutely. Um, I mean, it says a lot that that city that had been controlling the world for so long was laid siege to, and all their statues were melted down. Um, the in particular, the pagan statues, is my understanding, is what they were melting down.
Yes,
And of
we
course,
perhaps it's a good time to mention that at the time, Rome was the seat of the papacy. The Christianity was strong, was the formal religion of the empire. They have turned into Christians at the time, but they were still some of the citizens of Rome were still pagans. So
right.
they still worshipped pagan gods, but I understand that it was done mainly in private. They weren't allowed to do it in public. And the formal, the official religion of the empire at the time was Christianity.
Well, and it probably was very psychologically damaging to see these old statues that, if nothing else, they felt that they had a historic value in their society, that it was part of their Roman history, part of their Roman culture. They were melting down these statues, which had been symbols of pride for Rome for a long time and had stood for a long time.
Yes. Now, if I'm trying to connect this to what is happening today, so as we said at the time, Rome was overrun by invading tribes, those Germanic tribes, and it happened in the north and in the west, in the east, probably everywhere, and they constantly had to fight them. And today we have also, it's not the same, it's not the same thing, but we do have mass immigration into Europe, into the United States, by immigrants who don't necessarily share the values of the local population. And that is important because it sows the seeds of strife. It creates these tensions between the locals and the immigrants.
Right. And then you have cultures that, some aspects of them might not necessarily be compatible, trying to coexist with each other and figuring out, what can we accept and what are we willing to let go, and should they respect these laws that don't exist in the countries where they came from? Is this going to be damaging to our traditions? Um, so there is some similarity there. The weird thing
Yes.
about today is it's so controlled. It almost seems like there's an outside force. Some might say the New World Order, um, paying off various politicians to pass these laws to immigrate all these people, because in the Roman times, this was much more just tribes moving around Europe, they coming into conflict with each other, whereas today, I mean, these people are being given plane tickets and boat tickets, and they're coming from a really long ways away, as opposed to just moving across the same continent they're already on. But nonetheless, I guess regardless of how they got here, that there is a similarity there.
Yes, and it's creating tensions within the population between locals and newcomers, and there's some xenophobia there, also hatred towards immigrants. It exists. It existed also in the Roman Empire, and it exists today. And of course, there's this lack of social cohesion. I think it's another factor which contributes to the fall.
Yeah, I think that you're totally right. On top of that, other things that can cause societal collapse, um natural disasters. We've been seeing a lot of natural disasters recently in the United States. We've had these huge fires in California, and I'm not sure what it's going to look like once it's all said and done, the dust settles, all the ashes are cleaned up. A lot of value was just burned to the ground in the Los Angeles area. Um, and so it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out, because these were some really high dollar properties in the Palisades area. A lot of those homes are, over $1 million. And so it's pretty staggering, to have that much real estate, that much wealth in the form of a tangible asset all burned down in one sitting. So I don't know how much help they're going to be able to give to these people. I'm not sure what is going to happen, to all of the loans, because a lot of those properties aren't going to be paid off. Uh, you know, are the banks going to eat this? It'll be really interesting to see what happens. But natural disasters can be a big problem for
Yes.
countries.
Yes. So societal collapse, as you say, it is sometimes associated with a natural disaster, but it could also be the result of war, of a plague, of famine, or bad leadership, or a combination of all those factors. And it's perhaps a good time to discuss the theories around this concept of societal collapse. First of all, I want to say that this is not fiction. Okay, this is not science fiction. This is not some kind of a movie that you see. Because it actually happens. We
Yeah, this
have
has happened to societies.
yeah, we have historical accounts of societies which collapsed. I'm just going to mention a few. For instance, there's the late Bronze Age collapse. There's the Easter Island culture, which collapsed. There's the Mayan Empire, from South America. And of course, the fall of the Roman Empire is the ultimate example, which we talk about because it's near and dear. It was this is the culture which inspired Western civilization. So some of those civilizations, they go through what we call a dark age. So they have this major decline, and later they manage to recover. Okay, perhaps it's not exactly the same form or the same language or the same customs, but it is the same civilization, just as Western civilization is the daughter of the Roman Empire. But some cultures disappear completely, and we have evidence of that.
Right, absolutely. We have proof that it happens, and Rome really was, um, the society that laid the groundwork for um, a lot of our things that we use today, our calendar. I mean, a lot of, even here in the United States, a lot of our government buildings have this Roman-inspired architecture with these beautiful pillars, outside. Um, the
Yes,
idea
definitely.
of being innocent until proven guilty. So some of our legal concepts came from Rome. So really,
I
they
think
did
the
influence
entire
us.
idea of a republic,
Right. That's a good point too.
because the Greek invented democracy. You could say, but I think that in structure, America resembles the Roman Republic more than Athens, for instance. Yes.
You know,
So I want to mention a very important concept, which is the idea of decline in complexity. When we talk about the collapse of a civilization, it is characterized by it becoming less complex, because a civilization is complex by nature. And what do we mean when we say a complex society? It has all sorts of functions, which, for instance, a simple society, a simple agrarian society wouldn't have. For instance, having a court system. When you have a bunch of peasants living in a village somewhere, they don't necessarily need a court. they can somehow, even if they do have, you know, they're
Issues.
fighting between, yeah, even if they're fighting between them, they can come to agreements between them. They don't necessarily need a courtroom and a judge and those all those. I lost the
Right.
word.
All those police enforcement officers. I mean, you
Yes,
figure you got a really bad criminal around who's doing some terrible things, and a bunch of the
and
local
and
guys.
all those lawyers.
Right. All those lawyers are replaced with 10 guys with pitchforks.
Because essentially, uh, what does it mean that we nowadays have a court system and we have those judges and we have all those lawyers? These guys are not creating food. They're not
Right.
creating anything of true value, any tangible commodity. They're not creating any tangible commodity. And that means the people who do need to somehow feed them.
Right. They need the larger society to exist in the positions that they do, the larger
So,
complex society.
because eventually everyone needs to eat. So all those functions that we have in a modern complex society, such as universities, such as the media, such as even high-tech industries, they need someone to feed them. So they need, so you have fewer, the more complex the society becomes, the fewer people you have who are actually engaged in agriculture and feeding the rest of society.
Right.
So a collapse of society is associated with a rapid decline in the amount and the sophistication of those roles. Everyone is forced into subsistence farming because there's famine, because there's just fewer resources. So everybody is forced to leave whatever they're doing and go back to the fields and start try to make a living, to live off the ground. And that means that universities are abandoned. That means that courts are abandoned because nobody's, has the resources to maintain these institutions.
Right. And then, all those little fun products, the plastic back scratcher makers, you name it, the guys who make squeegees for cups, people that make pen holders that go on your rear
Yeah,
view
and
mirror, all these little things suddenly no one really needed those to begin with. It was just a convenience thing.
yeah,
And
think about all the entertainment industry. Think about our the Hollywood and all those TV stations. Now, if you are going through a crisis in which people are hungry and there is no food, and they all become obsolete, nobody needs them. So nobody's going to maintain them. So, so what
right.
we see during a collapse is a complex society suddenly becoming a simpler one.
And what's interesting about that is already a lot of the preppers, um, they're all interested in growing their own food. Well, I guess I shouldn't say all of them, but all the ones that are outside of cities, they all want to have at least a good sized garden, even though they don't have to, even though they can still go to the grocery stores right now and, work their 9 to 5 job. But I do think that's really interesting.
Now, another important point is that, we assume nowadays that we remember how to do all those sophisticated things. And even if we do abandon the courts and the universities, then within a few years after things stabilize and we manage to produce enough food, then we're going to be able to return and, reinstate the judges and, have those TV stations again up and running. But what happens is if you abandon all these institutions, then after a generation or two of that, the technology is forgotten. We need to realize that a lot of the knowledge that we have, how to produce things, it is held within the memory of actual people. And when you go to work at a factory, for instance, you're going to have someone who's been working there for a few years, who has this knowledge, and he's going to teach you how to produce those gadgets.
Right.
You're not going to sit around with books or manuals. Perhaps some people perhaps do sit around with books and manuals, but within a few generations, even the books, even the manuals are going to be lost, destroyed in a fire, or just lost, just abandoned. That nobody's going to find them. And what we see during a collapse of a civilization, what we see is that technologies are forgotten. And nowadays we are used to seeing technology only advance. We have never seen a society going back in its technological sophistication. We haven't seen it with our own eyes, so we can't even imagine how it would look like and how it would feel like losing things that we're used to. Just imagine if we didn't have electricity, because for some reason we didn't have fuels, or we didn't have the necessary materials to maintain electricity. So, at first you have blackouts, or you have brownouts, and you have electricity only in perhaps certain sections of the city, or only half the day. And but as you deal with it, as you maintain it less and less, because there's fewer and fewer resources, so then eventually you could arrive at the point that you forget how to maintain those power stations.
Right. You know what's interesting on a side note, I am oftentimes surprised how few young people are comfortable doing woodworking, like repairing their wooden furniture on their own. It's something that they largely took out of the schools here in the U.S., the wood shop. But something as simple as that, you know, because a lot of folks from my generation took wood shop, and if they needed to, it might not be the best table, but they could make themselves a table.
Yeah,
You,
I
you,
do that myself, by the way. I do some woodwork around the house, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say that, but my father, he was great at it. He actually taught it, and
oh, that's great.
I learned some from him, but I didn't give it much thought when God rest his soul, when he was alive. I didn't take the opportunity to learn it from him directly, but so I had to, after he passed away, I had to complete the knowledge from other sources, such as YouTube, and some trial and error also. But I do some woodwork around the house, and I enjoy it tremendously.
Oh, that's great. I enjoy doing woodworking too. I don't do it as much as I used to. And it's similar to you, my dad is much better at it than I am.
And by the way, the one of the reasons that I took it up, that I adopted it, is because I was thinking about a potential, a potential collapse, and wanting to have a skill which is practical, which can be used in a time of an economic decline, such as the one that we may have during our lifetimes. It was in the back of my head that perhaps I want to have another skill, an applicable skill, a useful skill that can be used in such a scenario. It's important to have skills beyond your official profession. It's good to have skills beyond that. So we have the theory of Professor Joseph Tainter. He's very famous in this field. You could say that he's laid down the groundwork for this entire field of research regarding the collapse of civilization, the collapse of civilizations. And his theory, the gist of his theory, is that there is such a thing as a diminishing return on social complexity. And I'll try to explain it. It's not that complicated. The idea is that as society grows, as society becomes more complex, it solves problems. using this idea of creating functions within society, like the ones we mentioned, the court system and the academia and the media. But we pay a price for each of these functions. Yeah, it means that fewer and fewer people who are actually engaged in producing food need to sustain more and more people who are engaged in other things. And he argues that at first there is benefit to it. Society benefits from having those complexities, but as time goes on, there is less and less benefit to society from adding more and more functions. And at a certain point, you arrive, at that stage of corruption in which you increase the complexity of society, although it brings no benefit. For instance, bureaucracy. Yes, think
Sure.
about all the. If you add more and more bureaucrats, more and more government officials, each and one of them gets a nice salary and a nice pension, and they bring no benefit. At a certain point, they bring no benefit. As a matter of fact, they're only hurting the economy because they're creating all those rules and regulations which complicate business for average folks to the point that the economy is paralyzed.
Yeah, they're just a burden on the people that are actually producing things oftentimes.
Yes, and that's another point of similarity between what Joseph Tainter is describing and what we're seeing today. That we are seeing, we have reached a point in which we have a diminishing return on social complexity, and eventually this could absolutely collapse our economy, just like the Roman economy collapsed during the third century. And eventually, this could even lead to a complete societal collapse. So, if it gets bad enough to the point that we can't feed ourselves and people leave their offices, yes, they leave the schools, they leave their high-tech jobs, and they go out to the fields and they start farming again because there's no food to buy at the supermarket. This is the essence of a collapse.
Right. I mean, you're in bad shape if there is no food at the supermarket. Either that or your wages aren't providing you enough income to buy the food from the supermarket, and it's time for you to go out and survive on your own again. It's very odd because that's also kind of the groundwork for the starting of a society is everyone can feed themselves. And then they start organizing and say, okay, great. Well, now that we have this extra abundance, we can start getting people more specialized. And so you're just watching all of that revert. And my understanding is that by the after the fall of Rome, um, the people there had lost the ability to manufacture ceramics, bricks, to work with iron. I mean, that's really interesting stuff. And
Yes.
if
There is a professor called Professor Brian Ward Perkins, and he is both an historian and an archaeologist, and he studied Roman archaeological sites before and after the collapse of Rome. And the interesting things that he noticed is that they actually lost certain technologies which we assume to be basic, like the manufacture of ceramics. Because we think of we take for granted articles which are made of ceramics, such as pots, such as bricks, such as roof tiles. But in fact, there is certain technology behind them. You need to burn those items. You need to burn them in a kiln at certain temperatures in order to make them waterproof. In order to make them waterproof, you need to burn them at very specific temperatures, and you need to raise and then lower the temperature slowly so they don't crack. And this is a technique which, after the fall of Rome, was lost. And for a while, certainly in distant provinces of the empire, such as Britain, they didn't have that ability for like 200 or 300 years.
That's really interesting. That's a long time to be without those
Yes.
basic things, bricks, pots, roof tiles.
Yes.
Uh,
He
they,
also mentions other things which disappear, such as everything that has to do with iron, the ability to work with iron. There are no nails found in archaeological sites after the fall of Rome. And there's also an
Nice.
interesting thing that he mentions is a huge decline in the amount of coinage. Because in every Roman site, you find plenty of coins. Even the simple, I'm not talking about the denarii, the silver coins. I'm talking about the simple bronze coins, which they used for change.
Right.
They simply disappear after the collapse of Rome, which perhaps indicates that they stopped trading with each other, that they reverted to barter.
Just yeah, you need a sack of potatoes. I got a couple chickens. You want to make a trade? They had to go back to these types of transactions, and that's totally crazy. And that the thing about those situations is it's very hard to gauge value, and so a lot of times these things aren't going to go as smooth as it might seem like. If it's a good friend or a neighbor you get along with well, maybe that's fine. But it is hard to figure out what that equivalency is, and even with silver coins, there could be some difficulty in those situations. Let's just say I do have silver coins and I want to buy a chicken from someone, and we know what a chicken costs now. When it's at the supermarket, it costs 8-9 bucks. Well, what would the true value of that silver be in my mind during a collapse? What would the value of that silver be in his mind during the collapse? And I'm sure that everything would work out, but these things might be a little tricky.
Yes, and I want to mention the Romans in Roman times, they had millions of coins in circulation. Today you can actually purchase a Roman coin, a nice Roman coin for not a lot of money. It exists. It exists in abundance.
Yeah, it's
And
surprising. Yeah, I've been looking at a couple.
yes, and after Rome falls, it just disappears. For a few hundred years, they had a dark age in which probably there wasn't much trade going on to the extent that they didn't need all those coins. And one last thing that I want to mention as evidence for the decline is that there is you see a dramatic drop in the amount of the population because Rome was a city of about 1 million people at its height. And during medieval times, it was reduced to 20,000 people.
That's unreal.
At the end of the 6th century, they say Rome declined to 20,000 people. And at the time, it was considered still a large city at the time.
That's really interesting. I bet it was odd to go into that city because even though a lot of stuff had burned down, I'm sure there was still a lot of evidence that it had been much larger at one point. And I bet you that was a creepy feeling to go into Rome when there was only
Yes,
20,000 people living there.
yes, the citizens of Rome at the time, during the Middle Ages, they were surrounded by all those relics, all those ruins from a Roman era. And the thing is, they didn't use all those beautiful buildings because they couldn't maintain them. They didn't have the ability, the resources in order to maintain them. So they just lay in ruin and they just got destroyed. And they even used some of the bricks, some of the stones in order to construct their own buildings, their own small houses. So you had the mighty Roman Forum. They just constructed all those houses along the forum. This beautiful square of ancient times became this, this shanty town.
Kind of a slum.
Yeah, this mass of hovels.
That's really interesting. I well, and I guess you might as well reclaim the bricks if you're in that situation. And then I guess that farm animals also got smaller during that time period. Is that
which is
correct?
which is another amazing thing is they probably we don't have direct evidence we just have the size of bones which could potentially indicate that farm animals were smaller after the fall of Rome, probably because they didn't have enough food to feed them, so they weren't as large and as fat as they used to be.
That makes sense. And you maybe getting slaughtered at a younger age. So it was more difficult to tell which ones would grow to be really big, which one you would use as your like breeding cow, for example, your breeding bull.
Yes.
So
And
yeah,
and one more thing, where they didn't have stones and bricks to reclaim from ancient buildings, they moved to building with wood. And after the fall of Rome, you mainly see wooden buildings, which of course don't last as long.
and so it stayed like that for hundreds of years. Is that correct? With the buildings
Yes.
being made out of wood?
It took them hundreds of years to return to the level of technology and sophistications which the Roman had. And one of the best examples is that, you know, the Romans invented concrete. They had this formula of concrete.
It was very good concrete as well, made out of volcanic ash.
Yes, somewhat. It's not the exact same concrete that we use today, but they did have concrete, and it was forgotten. People didn't know how to make concrete until the 18th century. So this secret was lost for over 1,000 years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, their concrete was really good. I sometimes wonder if the modern age structural grade concrete is even up to par with what they were making with the volcanic ash a long time ago in Rome.
Yes, and to this day, we have the largest unreinforced dome, which is made of concrete at the Pantheon in Rome, one of the largest surviving Roman structures.
That is so cool.
Yes, it's an amazing building to look at. It's amazing to behold.
It would be awesome to see that in person sometime.
I have to admit, I never had the chance. I never visited Rome, but I want to do it one day.
Yeah, me neither. I would like to one day as well. I wonder if you'd like to touch on real quick um, after they had paid off King Alaric, it that didn't satisfy him for very long because he came back in 410 um, to Rome, and they did send 6 legions to guard it that time. But he ended up sacking it. The legions decided to fight him outside of the city walls, and then later in 410, Alaric passed away. He didn't even make it beyond the end of the year. I just thought that was really interesting too.
Yes, well, we arrive at the conclusion of our story, which is the sack of Rome. So, as we've said, Alaric plundered the gold and the silver of Rome in 408 AD, but it didn't satisfy him for long. Because, of course, after you get a taste of that gold and silver, you come back for some more. So he started threatening to lay siege on Rome again. And Honorius, Emperor Honorius, this time rallied his troops and he sent six legions. He sent 6 legions to protect the city. But their commander, he was kind of a fool. He was foolhardy. Instead of protecting himself behind the mighty walls of Rome, he went into battle. He marched on into Visigoth territory, and he was outnumbered, and his troops were absolutely destroyed, and he was defeated, and only a handful of them managed to escape and return back to Rome. So that was another defeat which the Romans took. And later on, after some more negotiations with Honorius, which failed, eventually in 410 AD, Alaric and his troops arrive again at the gates of Rome. And this time they cannot be placated. This time they cannot be, bribed to leave the city alone. And on August 24th, they enter Rome, and this begins the sack of Rome. This is absolutely terrible what is happening there. They pillaged the city for 3 days, killing, raping, destroying many monuments. For instance, the mausoleums of both of Augustus and Adrian, those great emperors, and they just throw away their ashes. Their ashes are scattered, and they just, they take all the precious possessions, all the gold and silver items which are within these buildings. Everything is stolen. And the only two monuments which are spared, by the way, are the two major churches, the two major basilicas of St. Peter's and St. Paul's. And that's because the Visigoths themselves were Christian. So they spared those two mighty churches. But many Roman aristocrats are taken captive, including the emperor's own sister, Galla Placidia. That was her name, Galla Placidia. She's also taken captive, and some were ransomed, and others were sold into slavery. And you have refugees from Rome fleeing the cities, going to all sorts of other provinces, such as provinces in North Africa and in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire. Even some of them arrive at here, at Israel.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, there are accounts of monks at the time, which monks who accepted refugees from Rome in their monasteries here in the Holy Land.
So they
And the
traveled a
stories are
long ways.
terrible. The stories are terrible. These are people who were very powerful, very rich, aristocratic, who lost everything, who found themselves as refugees, just scattered all across the Mediterranean, looking for some place of refuge. And naturally, a huge decline in the population of Rome. Rome is not completely destroyed. After the sack of Rome, it continues to exist, and the empire continues to exist for a few more decades. As you said, Alaric leaves the city and dies very soon after, probably from some kind of disease. But the Visigoths, they become, entrenched within the Roman Empire, and you have all sorts of warring tribes just eating away at the remnants of the empire. And this is pretty much the end. Now, there's this amazing story, this an absolutely amazing story demonstrating the lack of leadership at the time. The historian Procopius records a story that on hearing the news that Rome had perished, Honorius, the Emperor Honorius, was initially shocked, thinking that the messenger was speaking about his favorite chicken, which was also called Rome. Yes,
That's so
it is amazing.
crazy.
Yes, that's so crazy because Honorius, so it turns out, he that was his hobby. He raised chickens. And Rome, that was the name of his favorite chicken. So he heard that Rome had died. So he reacted. So
He
they
thought it was
say,
his chicken. Yeah,
yeah, I
that's
thought it was his chicken. He cried out and said, and yet it has just eaten from my hands. For he had a very large cock, Rome by name, and the eunuch, comprehending his words, said that it was the city of Rome which had perished at the hands of Alaric, and the emperor, with a sigh of relief, answered quickly, but I thought that my foul Rome had perished. So great, they say, was the folly with which this emperor was possessed. So it demonstrates that, by the way, this was not dementia. He was just 27 at the time.
that's crazy. I mean, and absolutely nothing comparable to some of the really impressive Roman emperors. Yeah,
Yes. And
says a
he
lot that he
perhaps he
thought
was a
that.
half-wit. We don't know for sure what was his problem, but it's definite. We know for sure that there was no leadership at the time.
Right. And if you did go to speak to him, he might have no understanding of what you're talking about.
Or no interest because he didn't even live within Rome, so it didn't bother him personally.
Right. He was detached from it.
Yes, that's just one of those incredible stories that illustrate how bad leadership contributes to the decline of civilizations.
Like if we couldn't get rid of Biden, the situation we would eventually end up in. that that was their Biden.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
was
that
their Biden, and not even the result of old age, simply the result of, I don't know, either inbreeding, uh,
something.
something just, you know, or having no interest or no care, being born into an aristocratic family, being pampered perhaps to the point that you don't care about your own people anymore.
Right, just so self-serving and so spoiled.
Yes, and I'll just finish the story by saying that officially the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, existed until 476 AD, when the barbarian warlord Odoacer deposed the last emperor Romulus Augustus, who at the time was only 11 years old. He was just a figurehead. So, in a state of turmoil, in a state of constant war, the empire exists for another 60 years, but of course, it's greatly diminished, it's weakened, it's an empty shell of itself. It's bears no resemblance to the might of Rome, at its height during the days of Augustus and the days of Trajan and Hadrian.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely not comparable any longer at the end there. Well, I think that was a great way to end this. Um, to everybody who is watching, thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next conversation. Check out Orrin on X, check him out on YouTube. I will leave links to his social media accounts in the description. Orrin, thank you so much for your insight, and I do look forward to speaking with you next time.
yes, thank you. Can I leave you with just a final thought, very briefly?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so there's this concept that comes from a book by Ernest Hemingway. So it's the book called "The Sun Also Rises." Very quick quote from that book when he asks, "How did you go bankrupt?" And the answer is two ways: gradually, then suddenly. And why is that so important? Because the decline of civilizations tends to be gradual at first, and then the final stages of it come suddenly. And I liken it to a building, to a mighty, castle
Okay.
whose foundations are gradually eaten away, like by the waves of the sea. And at first, you don't see that the structure is weakened because superficially it looks the same. But if you check and see, you'll see that the foundations are eroded. And eventually, some kind of a crisis comes along, some kind of a storm comes along and knocks down the building. And the question is, who is responsible? What is responsible for the destruction of the castle? Is it the final storm, or is it the constant erosion of the foundations throughout many years? So you need to think about it. When you are eroding the foundations of society, for instance, by undermining its values, its laws, its traditions, the society still exists and the economy still exists, but perhaps you're weakening it to such an extent that a storm will come along, some kind of crisis will come along and knock it down. A crisis which you would normally be able to sustain and deal with suddenly becomes an existential crisis because the foundations were eroded.